Hey everyone, Wazoo here, and hoping you're having a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Today we are going to be looking at updating one of the existing projects that we've tackled before on this channel from Spring Boot 5 to, Spring Boot 2, to Spring Boot 3. I meant to say Spring Security 5 up to Spring Security 6. Yeah, so this is our blog application that we tackled in a previous video. I'll give a link in the description down below. And I figured it would be a good exercise going through a conversion from updating an existing Java project from Spring Boot 2 to the newly released Spring Boot 3. Right in front of us here is the GitHub repository page for it. And I've created some releases. If you go to the website and check the releases page out, you'll see I've tagged a release specifically containing Spring Boot 2 code just so we could use it for the purposes of migrating to the newly released Spring 3, like I've been saying. Okay, just to give us all a refresher on what it looks like. Okay, so you can see this is a pretty minimal looking blog application. We've got 2 sample posts here that we can go in and check out, and we can create a new post as well as register a new user or log in with an existing user. So everything looks good there. The app is up and running, and so now let's go through a few steps that you might go through when updating your project from Spring Boot 2 to Spring Boot 3. Okay, so we've opened up the project in IntelliJ as we see, and we've got the POM XML file open here, and you'll notice here that we've got our version set to 2.7.8 and along with the other dependencies that we have for the project. So let's quickly check the start.spring.io site to see what version of Spring Boot comes with a new Spring Boot 3 project. I know there's other ways to check, but that's pretty much the easiest way I can think of at the moment. So I see here that it's 3.0.2. Perfect. So let's go back to our POM file and let's update this to the 3.0.2 version. And what I also wanted to do is the default version of Java that comes with new start.spring.io projects are using Java 17 by default. So I'll stick to that default. And then down here in our Thymeleaf extras dependency, we've got an extras Spring Security 5. So let's go ahead and change that to Spring Security 6. And then we're going to add one more dependency. The Spring Boot project comes with a properties migrator sort of helper. So in the dependencies section under here, let's add a new dependency. And it's called the properties migrator. This is a helper tool for giving you any notification if any of your properties in your application properties configuration files, basically, for your Spring Boot server are making use of any deprecated property names. So we've gone ahead to add this, and this can be removed once you're happy with the project, once you've completed a migration. You don't need to keep this in here for permanently. So let's go ahead and refresh it. We'll reload the project. The same thing, I believe in Visual Studio Code, it reloads for you, the dependencies reload for you automatically. At least it was for me when I was playing around with this earlier. So let's go ahead and hit build. This won't be able to run right away. There's a few changes we're going to make because we have a few Spring Boot 2 specific things. Okay, so here's the first thing. In our models, we've got, let's just expand that out a little bit. In our models, we're making use of the javax.persistence package names for a lot of our declarations and properties of our entities. And so in Spring Boot 3, this becomes jakarta.persistence. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to replace all this with jakarta.persistence.star. just make it a little bit easier to read. So I'll do the same thing in account. Jakarta.persistence.star. And then in our post model, the same thing. We've got Jakarta.persistence.star. Okay, so far so good. There's another error there, but we'll address that shortly. Everything looks good here. And let's go ahead and rebuild. And we should get more errors. Okay, so the not null validation that we were using for this join to our account within a post, the many-to-one reference, I should say, we used this library, or this package, sorry, com.sun.istack. And I realize that this is very specific to this application. You may not be using it in yours, but I'm just going to go ahead and change this to the Spring validation tools. And to do that, we're going to go back to the POM XML file, I guess just before the migrator, because we'll eventually be removing the migrator, we'll be pasting in this Spring Boot Starter validation package. And once again, we'll go back and reload our Maven project. Hopefully it picks everything up for you automatically, whatever editor you're using. And so back in our post here, we'll remove this not null reference, and then we'll tell it to use, I think it already picked it up. Yep, in Jakarta validation. There we go. So it's using the not null validation constraints from the Spring Boot Jakarta package there. So let's go ahead and build some more. Okay, and so here comes the bigger change. So in Spring Boot 2 applications, for your Spring Security setup, most projects have been using some type of configuration that extends the WebSecurityConfigurerAdapter. And as I alluded to in the original Spring Boot blog video for this, we decided to already update it with the newer Spring Security 6 version approach, is maybe a better way of saying it, for handling any of our security declarations and paths and resources, etc. So we'll have to do the same thing here, and things like ant matchers, they no longer exist. We're going to have to be using something called path matchers, which is new for Spring Security 6. So let's take this step by step. So first, what we're going to do is just remove this web security, or extending. We're just going to leave it as WebSecurityConfig. We can even call it, we'll leave it as WebSecurityConfig. So there's no more enable global method security annotation. It's now just enable method security. And we'll keep the configuration and enable web security annotations. And we're also going to add another one from Lombok called required args constructor. Okay, so now the first thing out of the way. So now the second thing is we have to figure out how to convert this into a proper Spring Security 6 filter chain. And so that's the method that Spring Security 6 wants us to use, is creating a filter chain. We're going to be declaring a bean, and we're going to be returning a security filter chain, and I'll just call this filter chain. And we're going to be taking in an HTTP security object, and I believe it throws an exception. So we'll be working with this HTTP object. Eventually, at the very end of it, we'll be calling build and then returning that. Return HTTP build. Okay, so we've got our HTTP object. So first thing I want to do is set up the convert over the CSRF. Here we're disabling CSRF protection. So we'll do the same thing up here with, we'll take in the CSRF, and we'll be using the newer customizer methods, or the pattern that seems to be the approach that Spring Boot 3 is taking, enabling us to make use of customizers for all of these different parameters and object configurations. Okay, so we've got a CSRF, so we're going to be just calling disable. So we want to disable it around the board. Okay, and then what we're going to do, so we've got that set up. Maybe we'll just make it one line. Okay, now what we're going to do is we are going to update this headers. So edit headers, frame options, disable. So we're going to do the same thing. Headers. And then we're going to be taking in a headers configurer. And then we're going to be updating that configurer. So headers, frame options, and then disable. Okay, so next we've got we're setting up all of our requests here. So we've got request going to, we've got an ant matcher to permit any request to the root path, and then we've got an ant matcher to allow any request to the H2 console path, and similar for register and posts. So we can set up the same thing with the authorize HTTP requests configurer. Okay, so here what we can do is we'll take a request matchers. We'll first do the root path and a permit all. Okay, and then we'll do a request matchers and do a, I believe it's register, and a permit all. And then we'll take a request matchers and a, what's the other path here? Is it posts? Okay, so register and posts, permit all. And then there's a special modification for working with H2 console. We can't just say /H2 console. What I ended up having to do was using this request matchers and then path request to H2 console and then permit all. Okay, and what else do we have here? And then we've got the any request authenticated, which we can just cut and paste. And let's take that. And then we've got our form login section here. So what we can do is use a form login configurer function. Let's say we'll just call it form. Form, cut and paste most of this. Most of this should work. Okay, so we've got a login page. Set to login, a login processing URL, a username parameter, let's a password parameter of password, and then we've got a default success URL of /, and then the failure URL set up to /login with an error, and finally permit all. We'll just leave it with this. So let's just comment this out because we'll keep it around for while we're doing this migration. And then we've also got a method here for a part of to basically ignore everything with static file references. So if we've got CSS, if we've got JavaScript, if we've got static images that are on our website or that are in our Spring Boot container, then we can just ignore all the security on those to just make it easier to present those. We don't need extra security on those. So what we're going to do is instead of having a separate method here, what I'm going to do is just combine. I'm going to drop this up into our request matcher patterns here and see if it'll let us. So request matchers, See if it'll let us do this. So we don't have to keep all this. This was just an example. Currently in this project, we don't have any CSS or external JavaScript or images, not external JavaScript, but any JavaScript files that are shipped with this application, or any static images or fonts or even WebJars. But I just put this here because I have seen quite a lot of Spring Boot projects that do have all that stuff. And so this is one way that you can organize it to just basically ignore any security on it and allow them all through. Okay, so let's remove all of these grayed out dependency references since we're not using anymore. Okay, let's go ahead and build this again. And so far, so good. So we've got a successful build, which is promising. That didn't take us too long at all. And so what we'll do, of course, is I wanted to make one more change in our security setup, and I wanted to move our password encoder out of this web security config and just basically create like a global bean, application bean object. So in the config package, let's create a new class and just call it ApplicationConfig. And then we'll use the configuration and required args constructor annotations. And then all we're going to do is cut and paste this bean and drop it in here. And that'll just make it a little bit easier to separate our concerns. Okay, so let's go ahead and run it for the first time. Now, I mentioned before when we were talking about the application properties, we've got a configurer set up in the POM XML. And so what that's going to do is while you're loading up your application, it will alert you in the console logs if there's any property that's badly formed or deprecated. So it's no longer the proper sort of configuration. So I'll just briefly pop open our application properties, and just to as a refresher, so we've got a server port defined of 8080, and then we've got our data source configuration set up, as well as our H2 console setup. And we've got our Hibernate DDL auto defined here as create drop. So basically it'll create our schema for the database on startup and then destroy it on shutdown. And then just as a little fun thing is I've turned off the Spring banner that pops up in the logs or in the console whenever you run your application, whenever you start it up. So it doesn't look like from this output in our console log, it doesn't look like there's any property that we have to look at in terms of migrating. Your project, of course, might be very different depending on the size of your project and how old it is and what kind of properties you're defining that are now deprecated. Okay, so let's go back to our application and let's try to run it. Let's try to get into it. Okay, so let's refresh. Okay, so far so good. So we've got our data showing up. We've got our posts showing up okay. And it still works when we go into each of them. We can create a new post. Oh, it'll force us to log in, which is good. So let's register a user. So let's register user 1, last name user 1. Email is user1@home.com. And password will just be password. So let's log in with user1@home.com with password of password. And we get success. We can log in. So let's write a post 3. This is post 3. Oops. This is post 3. Publish that. Go to home. And you can see that we've got 1, 2, 3 posts, and we're logged in as, okay, let's expand that a little bit. Okay, you can see that we've got 1, 2, 3 posts and the new one we just wrote, and a little alert that our user is currently logged in. We didn't update anything in the logout configuration, so let's just double check the logout works. Okay, and it takes us back to the login form, and when we go back home, we're no longer logged in. All right, so that worked by default. We didn't have to configure anything for our logout. As we can see, if we open up localhost 8080/H2 console, we then get our login prompt for logging into the H2 console. So we're going to the JDBC H2 file :/data/demo, and we'll be using the username admin and password. So we can connect to it, and we can see our tables set up here for account. We've got some for post. Yeah, so everything looks good on the H2 console side of things. So that was a pretty successful migration, I would say. That was a lot faster than I thought it would be. I thought it would be a lot more difficult. But again, your mileage may vary on the application you're working with. So that's it for this video. I hope you found it enjoyable and gave you some tips on how to migrate your own project from Spring Boot to Spring Boot 3. If you liked what you saw, just give this video a like and leave a comment down below if there's anything that didn't work for you. And maybe also mention if you want me to do something with this pretty minimal layout. Perhaps a video on Tailwind or some other kind of CSS framework that makes this look a little better. Then I think we can do a little better than just some flat text coming out. So maybe that'll be sort of the next project that we'll tackle. Anyways, I hope you're having a good day wherever you are, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks a lot, everyone. Peace.